Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed. And we're here. We're
Here
2
we
weeks in a
are,
row.
2 weeks
Look at
in
that.
a row.
We're making it.
Barry
We're
didn't get
just,
sick.
yeah, on a roll.
Or Sissy.
And I
Yeah,
made it back
I
from
mean-
New York. I just have done a long road trip with my son, moving him up there. So I survived the road trip, made it back, and here we are.
One piece,
Yes, and only one vehicle this time.
one vehicle.
That's a story for another day on the podcast.
A lot of mixed feelings.
For sure.
Did you
Both
have
my boys in New York, and so
Did
Yeah.
you
Had
have
rough
a
lives.
if you could have a highlight of moving both of your boys to New York, what would be your highlight?
I mean,
of
just
your New
being
York
with
trip?
them, seeing them in their new space, and
Yeah.
being, I mean, I had shake voice as I was saying goodbye to both of them. You know that, like, but I'm really excited for them and kind of a new chapter. And both of them have these kind of pockets of community as they're
Mhm.
getting established up there. So yeah, really excited.
Well, we miss Will on the pod,
Yes,
kind of on the pod.
We do miss him.
Will has been a part of the Formed podcast for a long time,
Yep,
and
from the get-go, I
behind
think.
the cameras. So
This will tell us if he's actually listening.
I know
That's right.
It's like,
That's
Will,
right.
did you listen this week? So thank you to Will, but he's enjoying life in New York
Is.
City right now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, today you've seen the title of the podcast. It's a harder subject.
Mm.
It's a subject that so many of us, if you're on on social media or you have friends in particular in the DFW area, that if church has been in the headlines over the past few weeks or few months, it has unfortunately been due to a moral failure of someone in senior leadership or somebody on staff at a church in the Dallas area. And we just kind of want to have that conversation today of just not from an angle of, hey, we're up here,
Sure.
but
Mhm.
more of,
Mhm.
I think I've had more conversations over the past few months that have been really difficult to navigate
Yeah.
of both from believers of like, man, what is going on?
Yeah.
And also non-believers that's adding just ammo to the, well, why do I even want to get involved in church if this
Yeah.
is what church is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start from the beginning though with what would your message or what would you say to somebody if somebody's listening to this and they have been affected and personally hurt by a situation of abuse at a church or church hurt, and maybe they haven't came forward, maybe they're just walking through that right now.
Yeah.
Personally, I feel like that's the place we got to address first,
Yeah.
and then we can dive into the bigger picture of that.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say I'm sorry. Sorry for the ways that the church hurt you, for the ways we have not shown you the love, the care, the compassion of Jesus with our words, with our actions. Sorry for the pain and betrayal that you must be experiencing. The anger and confusion that I'm sure comes with all of that. Um, and yet I think I'd really plead with them to take the time to heal, and to find those safe people, whether that's community or a counselor. Like, how do you go about that healing process? And yet I think my prayer for them would be, don't walk away from Jesus,
Mm.
and don't give up on the church.
It's beautiful. I mean, I think that's exactly where my heart goes is a responsive compassion of recognizing that Jesus, so often when we see him on display in the pages of the Gospels, he is moved with compassion.
Mm.
And so to know that Jesus has compassion
Yeah.
toward those who have been hurt, those who have been wounded, that we want to respond in the same kind of way with the heart of Jesus, with a responsive compassion. And also recognizing that when Jesus is angry, we've talked about it, it's come up in recent episodes in our discussion. When you see the anger of Jesus on display in the Gospels, Jesus is angry about people who have misrepresented God, right? People who sort of position themselves to speak on behalf of God and yet misrepresent the heart of God.
Yeah.
And that's tragically, what's happening in so many of these situations is you have people, and part of what makes I think even so painful is um, Christian leaders are looked to
Yeah.
as those who
Yeah.
speak on behalf of God, and so then for that person to be the one who is perpetuating pain and abuse, um, that's where the real tragedy comes in. Is this is a fundamental misrepresentation of the character of God, the heart of Jesus, and so we want to be a church that um, does the best that we can to try to represent the
Yeah.
character of God, the heart of Jesus, and to be a place where people can come and experience safety and
Mhm.
experience healing
Mhm.
from church hurt. Um, yeah,
Good.
So when we read a new headline comes out or you get a text from someone saying, "Did you see blank?"
Mm.
mm,
Where does your heart, mind, where does that immediately go to?
I think for me, there's just every time you this comes across your headlines, phone or on the news or whatever it is, there's just deep grief.
yeah,
All right, there's just deep grief that not another. And there's deep grief for the pastor, the leader involved, and for the place that they find themselves in. There's deep grief for those who have been directly impacted, whether it's victims, their family, their church, people that have looked to them for guidance and leadership and care. So a lot of grief and sorrow over what has taken place. There's compassion for the people that have been hurt, that are experiencing this kind of pain. Because as you said before, the church should be the place where you're most valued, you're
mm,
most
yeah,
cared for, you're most seen as an image bearer of God. And so to be treated in some of these ways that we've witnessed over the years is really difficult, and there's this breach of trust, this loss of trust that takes place that can be really devastating for people, even if you're not directly
yeah,
impacted. Um, as you said, even for believers and non-believers. And so, when that happens, I think, one of my thoughts is who's caring for the victims? Are they getting the
mm,
the right resources in terms of a community that can support and care for them, in terms of counseling and other healing that is needed. Um, my mind goes to what happened, not in terms of give me the salacious details of
yeah,
what happened, but where were the
yeah.
accountability
How did we get
structures?
here?
Yeah, how do we get
Yeah,
here? How
yeah,
did this happen? And so what happened there, and some of that is just for I don't want this to happen
yeah,
to me. I don't want
Mm,
this to happen to us. So there's that. I think my mind often goes to I think of repentance and healing and restoration for that pastor or leader, for the people that he has hurt or she has hurt. Um, and there's consequences for our actions. So, James talks about not many of us should be teachers because we know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. And so there is a higher standard for pastors, and yet we recognize that we are flawed, sinful, broken people. Um, and so at the same time, while that's true, and while it's true there's consequences, what's also true is there's grace and forgiveness in Jesus, and those two things can coexist.
mm,
So there's that, and then quite frankly, every time something like this happens, I think, thank God that he's protected me.
yeah,
I think it's easy to think that would never happen to me. And
yeah,
maybe that particular thing might not be my thing, but I have a thing.
mhm,
I'm prone to sin. I'm prone to temptation. And so it's, there by the grace of
yeah,
God I go,
yeah,
right? Go I. There by the grace of God go I. It's the grace of God that holds us in these places. So I think there's all of those things that happen for me when something like that
yeah,
happens.
yeah. You know, I think about my I think my heart and mind immediately goes to the ripple effect as you
Yeah.
were talking about just the grief that is the circles of people who are impacted
Mm.
by a
Mm-hmm.
situation like this. So
Mm-hmm.
there is the um, sort of that nearest circle of those who have been victimized
Mm-hmm.
and the ways in which they have been, hurt by this situation. But then there are those that are in the circle of close relationships with those
Yeah.
family members of victims, family members of abusers, of
Mm-hmm.
perpetrators, and that have been impacted by this. But then the circle out from that of the leaders in that church that have served
Mm-hmm.
alongside those people who have walked with them and looked to them, and then the broader church community and the way in which this has that incredible kind of devastating impact. But then as you mentioned, you think about the wider circle out from that. People who
Mhm.
are unbelievers, who the cause of Christ is harmed
Mm.
by yet another example
Mm.
of hypocrisy of somebody who is supposed to represent Jesus to the world, who's now misrepresented him in this kind of painful, damaging way. And so, just the ripple effect that
Yeah.
comes from these kind of situations. And then I think, yeah, just like what you're saying, that there is oftentimes in my mind that desire to say, what, how did this happen? Right?
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Yeah.
And a big part of that is, um, so how do we make sure it doesn't get here with me?
Yes.
How do we make
Yes.
sure it doesn't get here with the people that I work alongside, that I have some sense of responsibility to, accountability for?
Mhm.
Um, and I think you're there, but by the grace of God, go I is so important. I I think I've talked before on the podcast about my relationship that I had with Dr. Howard Hendricks, the beloved professor at Dallas Seminary for decades, and the chance to be up close and personal with Prof. But remember Prof talking about a study that he was a part of, connected to, that looked at particularly men in ministry who fell uh, over a course of a 2-year period of time. There were
Mm.
like 240 men that this study looked at in 2 years, and one of the things that they all had in common is that they all said that can never happen,
Yeah.
right? It was
Yeah.
that sense of like, somehow that's somebody else,
Yeah.
right? That can never happen to me. And so having that humility that says, there, but for the grace of God go I, and
Mm.
trying to understand how did that happen so as to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
why do you think that feeling where does that come from, that feeling of invincibility or that
Mm.
can't happen to me, for a person in senior leadership at
Yeah.
a church?
I mean, I think there is something, and especially when you look at some of these, more high profile failures that we've seen, that there is what we might think of as sort of the corrupting power of power,
Mhm.
right? That
Mm.
the more power, influence, affluence that a person gets, the more prone they are to be corrupted by that. And so we wind up putting pastors on a pedestal and um, oftentimes endowing them with some sense of power. And then even the sort of the institution is now looking out to protect that pastor and his
Yeah.
power. And it just winds up kind of perpetuating this cycle. And so the power winds up then, um, I think it can go to a leader's head, and it can cause that leader to find themselves where they're then abusing that power. And so the 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 real importance of humility and accountability.
Mhm.
We can get into a little bit more of what I think some of the underlying causes that
Yeah.
contributed to this are. But yeah, that's my first thought.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add to that would be, I think pastoral ministry is different than any other kind of leadership role, where someone in another area can have authority, but there's a sense of spiritual
Yeah,
authority
yeah,
that's got a different weight than any other kind of authority, and I think that can quite easily, if not kept in check, go to um, a sense of an inordinate sense of self and of importance, and almost like a I'm untouchable kind
mm,
of thinking. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part would be, and I think this is generally true of all of us right now, and it's not the pandemic. I think the pandemic highlighted it for us, but there's this loneliness epidemic in the Western world, particularly in the US. Um, and I think pastors are especially impacted by that. And maybe that's a little bit of
yeah,
what you're going to
yeah.
talk
I mean,
about.
Mm.
so I've talked about, even with our team recently, about what I take to be 4 temptations peculiar to Christian leaders, and not peculiar in the sense of like nobody else experiences these,
Right.
but that Christian leaders experience them in a unique kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that are what really cause vulnerabilities in Christian leaders, and those would be, I talk about them in two E's and two I's. So ego, exhaustion, isolation, and image management.
Yeah.
And, I recognize these from my own experience as well as from the experience of people that I've served alongside, people that I've
Mm.
observed from a distance. But ego, not so much like somebody who is um, self-consumed, right? Big, certainly that can happen in
Mm-hmm.
Christian leaders. But I think the more persistent and really pernicious way in which ego comes into play is the confusion of identity and performance.
Yeah.
right? So that my sense of self
Yep.
gets bound up with what I do, and particularly my sense of self bound up with how things are going.
Mhm.
And so that can lead to a sense of, a sort of deflated, defeated sense of self if things aren't going well. But the problem on the other end is when things are going well,
Mhm.
it can lead to an inflated sense of self, an inflated sense of importance. And somehow we then confuse um, the notion of success, that
Yeah.
if our ministry is growing, if it's bearing fruit, that must mean that I am somehow being especially used by God,
Yeah.
and so it can lead to all kinds of sort of misunderstanding when we get consumed with sort of outward markers of success. So ego, that sense of the ways in which we confuse our identity and performance. Um, Exhaustion, just the reality that ministry is incredibly demanding of our time, of our energy, our spiritual resources, our
Mhm.
emotional resources, and can lead to a person sort of living from a place of perpetual exhaustion. The formula for burnout is energy depletion without some kind of commensurate renewal. And so when we live and lead from that place of being constantly depleted in our energy, physically, spiritually, emotionally, um, right? That place of exhaustion, that's the place in which then we're vulnerable. Ego, exhaustion, isolation, the reality of the loneliness of leadership. And the higher you go on the org chart, the sort of more isolated you tend
Mhm.
to be. And sometimes there's a dynamic of loneliness and leadership that is sort of inevitable, but sometimes the other factors that we're talking about contribute to that sense of isolation. And there's nobody now who's really in your life who's able to speak truth to you in a way that you need to hear it,
Mhm.
or that you're able to speak truth to, which then gets into the fourth one, which is image management, right? That when you're in a position of spiritual authority, when you're in a position of Christian leadership, there is this pressure that I
Mhm.
think that we can all feel, and this pressure that we can actually all exude onto each other to project an image that we've got our stuff together,
Mm.
right? And so that when we are struggling, when we are vulnerable, when we are prone to a particular kind of besetting temptation, that's not something we feel the freedom to be able to talk about because
Right.
we have to, you know, protect this image. And so, do you actually have people in your life that you can really be honest with about those places of weakness, of struggle, of vulnerability, of a relationship that's struggling or what have you? And again, the higher you go in that leadership role, the stronger that pressure is felt to try to project an image. And I think the combination of these 4 things is part of what makes Christian leaders, pastors, and especially I think even senior pastors sort of uniquely vulnerable
Mm.
in some pretty
Yeah.
important, significant.
Yeah, I think, and I think this goes along with kind of the pressure of image management is I think there is a lot of pressures on pastors today, maybe in ways there weren't earlier. I'm not saying it's never been like this, but you think about the role of a senior pastor in particular right now in an average sized church, probably preaching pretty frequently, if not every week. But right now, the way with access to social media, your congregants are listening to all these other
Mm,
great
mm,
communicators. So he's got to
mm,
be a pretty good communicator. He's got to be a good shepherd. He's got to be some kind of a CEO because he's probably trying to manage and run his church. Nobody teaches you that in
mm.
seminary, and most pastors aren't naturally inclined for that kind of work. And so there's all these different roles that are expected from this one individual, and that's a lot of pressure to try to bear up under. And if you're trying to manage that image to be able to say, actually, like I'm terrible at this part of it. How do I keep this all together? Not everyone can handle that kind of pressure, and that leads to some bad choices, I
Yeah.
think.
And none of this, we should be very clear, in any way is
No,
excusing
not
bad
at
Yeah.
all.
behavior.
Yeah.
But it is part of that work to try to say,
Yeah.
how did we get here,
Right.
right? So as to avoid.
What do we do?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So if
Yeah.
if you guys would be willing, what are some safeguards that you have personally in place, and maybe a chance to
yeah,
share
yeah,
IBC too,
sure.
that help you navigate or safeguard yourselves
Mhm.
against those 4?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few different circles that I sit in where I process how I'm doing
Mhm.
spiritually on a regular basis. One of those is with our senior leadership team, and so, obviously, there is a power dynamic there.
Yeah.
I'm still the boss, right? And so but we've tried to
He
create
loves saying that, guys.
He
He's
tells us all
Don't
the
ever
he
time.
forget,
tells us
that's
all the
He talks
time.
about the
Oh
senior
my
pastor card.
gosh.
He never does
Just
that.
kidding, just kidding. That might be the only time I've ever heard Barry say
Uh,
that.
we've really tried to create a dynamic with the 3 of us of really open, honest sharing, and so every time we sit down together for a meeting, we meet
Mhm.
together twice a week, and it always begins with, "How are we doing? How are we doing with Jesus?" And so that's a circle that I'm a part of, a couple of times a week where we're having that conversation. In addition to that, with our elder board twice a month, and they are very good to make sure to check in on how I'm doing. And we've created a dynamic, I think, in there.
Yeah.
And I've really tried to press past that image management and to really try to be vulnerable, with the folks in that room. And so we're together a couple times a month. In addition to that, we're with the chair and associate chair a couple of times a month. So just about weekly, I have some contact with our elder board, and they're asking, "How are you doing?" And we're really trying to stay, honest and vulnerable with one another in that regard. In addition to that, I have, then 2 circles, that I sit with some regularity. One is just a group of men. The sort of formal way I refer to them is my circle of counsel. Informally, they're my breakfast crew. We get together for breakfast, twice a month, and that is really a group of guys that, I have a real strong sense of trust with, can be really vulnerable with and accountable to. And so they're checking in with me. Part of the reason that we get together is for them to ask how I'm doing and for me to be able to share and kind of unburden. And that has been such an incredible gift to
Mhm.
me to have that space to just really be able to process how I'm doing and what I'm facing in leadership and how Kim and I are doing in our marriage and how I'm doing with the kids. And we're just, I mean, we go there and it's been really, really great. In addition to that, I have a group of pastors that I'm a part of, and so we meet a couple of times a year in person, and then multiple times during the year in between those gatherings that we're together on Zoom calls. And so that's kind of a regular gathering, and then I have another kind of group of pastors that at this point isn't meeting with the same regularity, but we're still kind of checking in on each other in a more sort of informal kind of way. And so I think a big part of it for me is just making sure that I'm in those spaces where I really can process, how I'm doing spiritually because, I mean, this is one of the unique dynamics
Mhm.
again of ministry leadership is how you're doing spiritually, how you're doing with Jesus
Yeah.
is essential to the job you do, right?
Mhm.
The guys that
Mhm.
are in my circle of counsel, they're all, outside of ministry, they're serving in different professional capacities and their success or failure, their job performance isn't essentially connected back to how they're doing
Mm.
spiritually. So there's just a unique dynamic that comes with that. So having people in my life that I can have those really honest conversations with is really important.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think about it this way. So I think about accountability structures, and so the 2 ways I think about it is, am I being honest with God? Am I being honest with others? Um, and so part of my rhythm is every week on Sabbath. One of the I sort of take inventory of my
Mm,
life, and one of the questions I'm asking is how's my soul,
mm,
and specifically where am I? I think back to that scene in the garden where Adam and Eve sin. They're naked and ashamed. They hide, and God comes looking for them. And he says, "Where are you?" Not because they were lost and he doesn't know where they are. It's a question of self examination. And so that's a question that I often use because I can come before God and not be honest.
mm,
And it's not that God doesn't know, it's that I'm not willing to
yeah,
confess. And so,
that's good.
am I being honest with God in that way of here are my fears, my insecurities, my temptations, where I've sinned? Am I confessing sin in that way? So, how am I doing with God? And then, how am I doing in being honest with others? Um, because part of my tendency is to, if I don't want to talk about something, I'm going to avoid it. And I think I'm pretty good at avoiding it. But if you know me long enough, you know when I'm avoiding it. And
Mm,
so, having that group of people who know you well enough to say, "You're not talking about this," or "You said this, but you didn't really get into deeply what's going on there with this relationship or that relationship." And so having that group of people. So for me, similar to what Barry said, obviously with both him and Brian, our executive pastor, in that SLT space. And I think you've done such a good job of not managing
Mm,
image,
mm,
of being
mm,
vulnerable and honest, that while there is a power dynamic and that's just the nature of it, he's given us permission to be able to
mm,
say, yeah, I'm not doing well, or here's what's really going on because he's done it. And so I think there is some freedom in that. You've done that with the elders as well, where I feel like I'm not sure there's a lot of churches that have the kind of relationship that the elders and the senior pastor and the leadership team have, where there is such honest communication and openness. And I think again, Barry, you've led the way in doing that. So there's that. But then I have a group of women that, and most of them have known me, I mean, nearly at least half my life, if not longer. And so they've seen me at my very best. They have seen me at my very worst. And I know that they love me. And so it's safe for me to say, here's where I'm struggling. Here's where I sinned this week. Almost on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, I have an opportunity to confess places where I've sinned. And it's sometimes just things like, I just need you to know that I really screwed up in this way. And I want to acknowledge it. And they might not even know the person, but it's getting to, why did that why did that do that in you? Why did that cause trigger you in that way? What's really underneath that? And to be able to process that. And so that group of people, but then thirdly for me is having a counselor. Of
mm,
oftentimes there have been times in my life where I need someone on the outside to speak into what's going on because I can't see it. And I might not receive it even from someone that's close to me, but maybe from a counselor who can help me process through why is that happening?
mm.
Why do I feel that way? Is another, is just another structure that I think has been really helpful to me.
Great.
There's a question. Were you gonna say something?
Well, I was just gonna throw in, you said something in the question about IBC also in
Yeah,
particular,
we didn't
like,
talk
Yeah.
what
about that. Yeah.
and so one of the things that I think is, that we have set up, as a church, that's kinda connected to this conversation is what we call our harassment and abuse care team,
Mhm.
and so that's a group that's made up of elders, some staff, and then lay people that just are part of that team, and part of the point, of having that team in place is, what sometimes happens whenever there is inappropriate behavior, there's been some kind of
Mhm.
abuse or abuse of power or, what have you. Um, there's a pressure on the leadership to sort of protect the
Mm.
organization, maybe to protect the leader, but certainly to protect the organization. And so it winds up staying in a very tight circle. And this is where churches, I think, really actually wind up getting themselves
Yeah.
in worse trouble
Yep.
when they really try to work for the protection of the organization as opposed to the protection of somebody who's been abused, mistreated. And so part of the structure of putting together that team the way that we did is that we're not going to um, have this in a very small circle of people who are in the know. We're not going to operate from a place of protect the organization at all costs. We
Yeah.
really are trying to operate in a way that if there's somebody is mistreated, that the concern is first and foremost for that person.
Yeah.
This is something that we put together that provides an opportunity to report for anybody who's in a leadership role, but also
Mhm.
it's even created an opportunity if there's experiences of harassment or abuse, domestic violence that are happening within our church body. They have an avenue actually to reach out and
Yeah.
get connected and get support
Yeah.
from this harassment and abuse care team.
Yeah. It's a appropriate level of
Yeah,
transparency.
yeah,
Yeah.
And you can find that on our website.
Mhm.
You can go to our website to um, follow those steps
yeah.
if that's something. Yeah. Do want to cover one question before we transition. I don't know how we're going to transition to our banter at the end, but
Very abruptly, like
Yeah.
usual.
We
but
usually do.
but at
Yeah.
least one question, just because timing. How do you have that conversation with somebody? And this is, I mean, I need this so much. I have a close friend that's like, "Hey, I'm done with the church. Like,
Yeah,
Mm.
too much stuff. That like this isn't even y'all are not even legit
yeah,
anymore.
Yeah.
Like, no
yeah,
offense to
Yeah.
you, but
yeah,
I mean
Yeah.
that's what I'm hearing.
yeah,
Like
yep.
from a friend. And how do you have that conversation with a non-believer or somebody who's given up on church because of every the moral
Yeah,
failures that have happened?
yeah. I mean, I think my first sort of response is, "I get it."
Mhm.
Like, I understand why you would feel that, um, that what's happened, what's happening is terrible. So, again, a response of, of empathy, a response of compassion. But then even as we talked about earlier with those, how we would respond to somebody who's been hurt, of a response of empathy and compassion. Um, but then also the reality of like this grieves the heart of God, right?
Mhm.
This is the kind of thing that angers Jesus. The righteous indignation of Jesus towards expressed toward those who misrepresent the character and the heart of God. Um, and yet to continue to point people back to
Mm.
Jesus, that despite all the many ways in which those who claim to be Christ's followers, claim to be God's people, misrepresent the heart of God, the character of God. Um, when you see the heart of God, when you see the character of God on display in the life, the death of Jesus, um, that there's something that is still so beautiful and so compelling
Mm.
about um, this story of the self-giving love of God on display in the person of Jesus, and to continue to come back to what we find in the good news of the gospel.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's responding with humility and honesty of acknowledging what has happened, the damage, that the pain that has been inflicted, instead of sort of sugarcoating it or say it's not that bad. So acknowledging it, expressing grief and sorrow for the pain that's been inflicted, um, and acknowledging that the church is made up of broken, sinful people,
Mm,
and yet we recognize that there has to be greater accountability to prevent things like this from happening. We don't want that. Um, that pastors are broken, sinful people, and yet similar to what you just said, Barry, that our failures don't cancel out the power of the gospel. Um, our faith is not centered on what we have done. Our faith is centered on what God has done for us through Jesus. The object of our faith is not us. The object of our faith is Jesus. And
mm,
so inviting people to see Jesus, to see who this God is, that he's this God that runs towards those who are broken, who are on the outside, who are marginalized, who are vulnerable. That if they would catch a glimpse of Jesus as just by reading the pages of the gospel, that they would see why he is so beautiful, why we may have not done a good job in representing him, and that
mm,
doesn't change who he is.
mm.
So yeah, I think it's an invitation.
Mm. Well, there's no great way to transition from moral failures and pastors to our banter. But thanks for having the
Yep.
conversation. I know I feel like we have deeper subjects, but this one
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
especially in our area, in
Yeah.
the DFW area right now. I mean,
Yeah.
we talked about it as a pastoral group a few weeks ago of
Hmm.
just we have so many connections to people at churches
Yep.
in the area, and just hard time.
Yep.
I don't know
Yeah.
how else
Yep.
Yeah.
to say it right now.
Yep.
But all right, transition. Bam.
Transition.
What do you got?
All right, so a source sent me a link this past week. The source was Sissy or Missy.
Missy.
Yeah, there you
Um,
go.
and it was an article about DoorDash, a food delivery service,
Mm,
and which I didn't know had been around for over 10 years, but
wow.
it was basically comparing
Yeah.
the top ranked or the most frequent things ordered from 2013 to 2023.
Hmm.
And so I just want to ask real quick, what do you think is the highest or the most frequently ordered thing from DoorDash last year?
Hmm.
Not a restaurant, but a food
A
item.
type of food.
Oh, okay. Not a restaurant.
Yeah.
Food item. Hmm.
Sissy, you sent this to me,
I
and
know, but now I
you
can't
don't even know
remember.
what it
And I
is.
remember being like, "Oh, that's
You're
not
like
what I
allowed to
thought."
cheat right now.
I
It's
know. I'm trying
gotta
to.
be tacos or hamburgers, right?
It was chicken. Was it chicken?
Oh,
No,
chicken.
it was French
No,
fries,
it's French
French
fries.
fries.
then chicken quesadilla, and then mozzarella sticks.
Mozzarella sticks.
Yeah.
Didn't
Like
see
that's what's
that come
random.
in.
Like you just
Hold up, y'all
order.
don't like mozzarella
I
No,
sticks?
but
mean,
like I don't just order
I
mozzarella.
did
Yeah.
have somebody come up to me at church and say they love Peeps and candy corn.
oh,
I was like,
Well,
I guess
they
we'll
got
pray
one
for
out of
them.
two.
you're halfway right.
No.
Let me show you some different in 2013, Chipotle chicken sandwich, pork pot stickers,
Oh, gotta love a pot sticker.
I do love pot stickers.
tomato soup, Cobb salad,
I do.
sweet
Yeah.
potato fries, guacamole, hummus, grilled cheese sandwich, tacos, and pita.
Huh.
A little bit healthier compared to French
Well, it's
fries,
got some
chicken.
Mediterranean flair there. Yeah.
Yeah, here's 2023: French fries, chicken quesadilla, mozzarella sticks, garlic naan, spicy chicken sandwich, pepperoni pizza, chips and queso, traditional wings.
Well, you're telling me mozzarella sticks is higher on the list than pepperoni pizza.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
I've ordered.
Yeah.
Cobb salad
They
and
must have had
fried
a
rice.
deal.
One of the differences they put in the article was how diverse the food choices were in 2023
Yep.
or 2013 compared to 2023. It's
Yep.
mainly American and Mexican food.
Interesting.
So, question: what's your go-to takeout order? Let's do both drive-through and what you would take like a takeout DoorDash order.
Okay.
Because I'm not trying to DoorDash like a fast food place.
I
Yeah.
never do drive-through.
Really?
Like
Yeah.
never.
Almost, very rarely.
That's
Wow.
so bougie.
Yeah, I don't do drive-through.
Chick-fil-A, number 3 combo, 12 count with large fries and
Love
a
it.
large unsweet tea.
Okay.
I knew his was Chick-fil-A. I didn't know it was the
Chick-fil-A.
number. I don't even know what
The
number 3 is.
three
What's the number
nuggets
3?
combo.
Okay.
That's your
nuggets.
drive-through and DoorDash?
No,
or-
that's
No,
not the
that's-
DoorDash.
that's
That's not the
drive-thru.
DoorDash.
Yeah.
That's the drive-thru.
Yeah.
Wait, what's the number 3?
That's the chicken nuggets.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets.
All right.
So.
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A is basically the only drive-through I'm
That you'll
doing
go to,
unless
yeah.
I
Unless
did
it's
some
a road
drive-through on the
trip or
road
something,
trip.
yeah.
Yeah.
I ate terribly on the road
Yeah,
trip. It was bad.
that's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All rules off limits.
Yeah,
in the
you just
road
need food
trips.
and get you through the drive. My DoorDash, okay, I have 2 because it's based on location.
Okay.
If I'm here in Dallas, it's going to be Tex-Mex, so it's whatever. It was like I got a place near me that I go to. Or fajita pizza, one of those. I like fajita pizza on
Good.
DoorDash.
Yeah.
If I'm in New Jersey, pizza, easy.
Wow.
Yeah.
You don't do pizza here. You only
Not-
do it there.
Yeah, no.
Because they
Papa
don't know how to
John's.
do it here.
Yeah, I'm not doing Papa John's or Domino's.
So we're always either doing Tex-Mex or Mediterranean. We'll occasionally branch out and
Yeah.
have something else, but it's either we're ordering fajitas for the family
Yep.
or we're ordering like the mixed grill stuff from Mediterranean.
That's good.
Okay.
That's a
Yeah.
good order too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know Tex-Mex is the go-to. Just something about getting chips and salsa just dropped off at your doorstep. I'm like, this is so first world right here.
Yeah.
So yeah. Can I give you my most embarrassing DoorDash order?
Uh-oh.
Most embarrassing. I DoorDashed one time with the kids. Barb was out on a trip, so it was just me with the kids. DoorDashed milk and cereal from Dollar General.
Milk and cereal.
So
You were
literally got
desperate.
dropped off
Yeah.
at my doorstep. They
That's
picked it on
awesome.
my phone. Like, I don't even care. Pick what
Just
cereal
pick
you want.
Just
Yeah.
pick
So
something.
I got dropped off a gallon of milk and then Lucky Charms and
Uh-huh.
like Cocoa Puffs.
That's awesome.
And I was like the most
I love
sugary
it.
cereal.
Yeah.
Probably too
Uh-huh.
young for this,
Yeah.
but I don't even care.
It was survival.
Mom's gone.
They loved me
Yeah.
for the rest of the night.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
was
you were,
great.
You were a good
That's
dad.
awesome.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Fantastic.
there you go. All right, here's your DoorDash 101
There you go.
from us right here. We'll be back next week for another week of form.